coach. All right, where are you guys on Shanahan? Is Shanahan, as Mina Kimes describes him, as the second best coach in football, and he's underrated, or is he closer to the 500 coach that his record says he is, and he's vastly overrated? Where are you guys on Kyle Shanahan? Are you fans of Shanahan, or do you believe that Shanahan is touted as better than he is? What do you guys think?
I think he's well over 500 now, isn't he?
He's a handful of games over 500.
46. 531. 6-3 in the playoffs. Right.
3 NFC championship games in the last 4 years. NFC championship game with the third string quarterback.
So I think he's one of the best coaches in the NFL, who also has flaws, blind spots. Like John has talked about it a lot. You would know this, Larry, from being in the league. Like coaches as GMs, they have different priorities than player development, long-term roster building. They want to win right now, right? You and Middlecoff could speak to that better than me firsthand. But I also think it's the evidence is pretty clear. He coaches regularly against some of the best coaches in the NFL. Sean McVay, one of the best coaches in the NFL, does pretty well against him. So I think he's a pretty damn good coach. We broke down the other day because Andy Reid's Philly tenure comes up a lot when we talk about Kyle as evidence.
He was roughly 500 in the playoffs in Philly.
Yeah, he's the evidence that if you go long enough without winning that championship, you too can be fired. But what gets left out of that is that, at the end, he missed the playoffs back-to-back. He didn't win a playoff game for 4 straight years at the end of that. Kyle has saved himself. Part of the reason we talk about him this way is because of what he does in the postseason. And that does matter.
Yeah, I just don't understand the argument. Does he have some flaws? Does he piss you off occasionally with a play call? Of course. So does Andy Reid, right? So Bill Belichick's done things that drive you nuts. But just in terms of the social media, should he be on the hot seat for fucking who?
I mean, that's ridiculous.
What are we? But even just it's incapable. The 49ers, it's not. They can't upgrade. It's not possible. And if they fired him, let's just say in a hypothetical world, how many teams would immediately attempt to hire him? Every team with an opening, and people would fire their coach to hire him.
15 teams would be after him.
So it's the conversation. To me, it's a waste of breath to talk about firing. But I wish he could just acknowledge. I wish I had the play call back in Philadelphia that got Brock hurt. Why is he incapable of saying, that one didn't work out? But he can't say that. That's the thing that bothers me. But that doesn't bother me enough for me not to act like he's not one of the best coaches in the league. And unlike really good coaches like Harbaugh or Tomlin, this guy impacts the game because he calls it, right? So he's a double whammy. He's the head coach, and his teams are always physical, and they're all, prepared in big games. And he calls half the game, right? That's what makes Andy Reid so valuable. If Andy Reid is the current best coach in the league, his teams are ready. He's great with all the players. He really values defense, like Kyle, and he calls the game. Even though people acted like Bieniemy called it for a while, he didn't. Well, they split it sometimes, but
Bieniemy's now where?
Split it at all.
Where's Bieniemy?
Commanders.
Football team.
Commanders. That's sorry.
The question is, does Kyle have a flaw that will ultimately prevent him from being capable of winning a championship?
Which is a better conversation than should they fire him.
Can he win a Super Bowl, or is his odds just going to be lower if he doesn't have an elite talent at quarterback? Right.
Because his margin's thinner. How does he get? But how could he ever get that guy? Right? He tried. It didn't work. There's an element. They didn't luck into Mahomes, but they kind of did. They had to trade from the 20s to 10. He got to redshirt. It was just perfect. Tyreek and Kelsey are on the team. It's very, very difficult to ever get, a top 5 quarterback.
Yeah.
I think Shanahan is a top 5 NFL head coach. And the one thing I respect the most about him is the guy's ball out. There's even during Walsh's tenure, there was times where I was like, man, Niners were flat. I don't feel like the Niners are flat. They got a great culture. They come to play. There's a energy about them every game that some teams. I watch every team in the league, and there's some teams that show some weeks. Some teams. Kansas City's a perfect example. They no-show 3 times a year. The Niners don't no-show for the most part. They show.
To me, you're allowed to no-show when you got rings, right? Because Pat would tell you, tell me when the game matters, I'll show up.
Yeah.
Like, the Niner
also-
example you gave, like Ronnie Lott's like, I already had 2 rings. So yeah, we blew a game in 87. Like, I'm a champion, right? So it's the Warriors, they know show a lot. Like when you're a champion,
Yeah. You turn it on, turn it off.
Yeah.
Also, the Chiefs' only losses are their no-show game. They'll lose 2 no-show games and then just 1 really good game, and they win 14.
I mean, they've been the best team in the league for 5 years.
Now, Niners won. You could also argue, what is Kyle's weakness is also how we see how good he is, because you can't get a quarterback, and yet he wins 13 games. How was he the 2 seed last year? Like how?
Oh, yeah. Well,
And I saw someone in the chat. It's a good point, right? Like his flaws when it comes to personnel, you have to also give him some credit then, because their roster's pretty damn good every year.
to me, and John, I feel like you and I should discuss this in the length sometime, but I was very skeptical of John Lynch going from Hall of Fame safety to broadcaster to how would he be as the general manager. And what Guy just said there is totally true. The Niners are stacked, and most years their roster is as good as almost any in the league. They're very, very deep football team, and I got to give Lynch credit. I feel like he collaborates well with Peters and his scouts, and yeah, they've swung and missed, but man, they do a nice job on day 3. They do a really nice job after the draft. They don't just get players too; they get good players. So I've been very pleasantly surprised by Lynch. I didn't know what to expect. There was no track record. Right? None of us knew what to expect, but he's been damn good, in my opinion.
It was a crazy hire at the time. You saw the tweet, whatever, when Adam Schefter. But if you look at it now, looking back, he's like one of the all-time great leaders. Like he's just a natural leader. Like if Peyton Manning became a GM, more than likely he wouldn't suck because he's just good with people, or Tom Brady. They were also dependent on who are your lead scouts? Well, he hired Adam Peters, who learned from Elway and Belichick. They brought in Rand Carthen, who's clearly pretty damn good. They got, the Niners have this kind of unique curveball in Parag, who's like a genius with money. So they didn't make a fuss. They immediately start working with him. And the guy, part of being a GM is like, who's your coach? And his coach is good. And really his role with the coach is to kind of calm Kyle down, because Kyle's kind of crazy, right? But other than that, and that's a natural, easy thing for John. Like Balky is not good at that, right? If a coach, Doug is very low key, so he's easy for Balky to deal with. But when he gets a tightly wound Harbaugh or Kyle, Balky and him would butt heads. Where John thrives with that. Like he's used to crazy with Warren Sapp or John Gruden. Like that's easy for John.
Go ahead, Guy.
I was just going to say, listening to Middlecoff talk, I was thinking of one of John Lynch's best skills doesn't get utilized. Like he would also be really good on as a GM of a franchise with an owner that is very involved, like Joe Lacob. But then I'd forgotten that we had talked about this before. I think Kawakami made the comment once. Kyle is kind of the guy he has to manage, right? Bob Myers had to manage Lacob, and he and Kerr, I'm sure they had to work through things there too, but you had to manage some of that. And you wonder in hindsight, to Middlecoff's point, like maybe he's the best possible guy to be paired with Kyle Shanahan, who might burn through GMs if he didn't have a guy of Lynch's stature and the qualities that he has.
I don't think Kyle could have worked with remember when they were trying to do the random pairings, get to know this guy. Guy Haberman.
Lou Riddick, nice to meet you.
Yeah. Guy Haberman from the Vikings and John Middlecoff from the Texans. That never would have worked, ever.
Yeah. They are a team. I mean, that was, there was a breakup. It's funny. I had some inside sources on the Balky Harbaugh thing, and that fell apart in the first 72 hours of the relationship because Jim, after he agreed to take on Balky as the general manager, went to Jed and said, I want Mike Lombardi. And somehow that got back to Trent, and so their trust was forever broken. And so that's why they were
together.
That's why Trent and Jim didn't work out because there was that trust was broken. That's the integral relationship is coach GM, and if you're starting on a bad tip, it's never going in any good direction.
But here's a good example. Even if Harbaugh hadn't done that, ultimately when Jim Harbaugh walks in the room, he's Jim freaking Harbaugh, played 15 years. He's the alpha. And Trent kind of has a big ego too.
Yeah.
Where I think John, it's weird, Hall of Fame player, obviously he's got an ego deep down, but he's very good at not showing it. And Kyle, while he knows he's more important because he's the head coach and he's the play caller, like he's not like he's going to be able to shove John Lynch around emotionally and definitely physically, right? So there's an element of that. Ultimately, it's football, right? I mean, the physical element plays a part in this. Now, your GM and your coach are ultimately doing business, right? You're negotiating contracts, you're deciding who to cut. So it's not like a machismo. You're not actually getting physical with each other, but with Harbaugh is a good example. Like that did come into play. And I do think with Kyle, like he just kind of feels like when he looks at someone and he thinks you're a weakling, you're just kind of dead to him.
And the whole thing, let's be honest, guys, whether it be NFL, NBA, baseball, doesn't really matter. It's like the whole GM head coach deal is doomed for failure because it's either you or me. Either you didn't get me enough players or I didn't do enough with your players. And so it's kind of the whole relationship is kind of doomed for failure. So you need to have somebody's got to be the mature adult in the room. And I think, not to say that Kyle's not, but I think John is so much that guy for the Niners. And Kyle's the star. He's the guy making the big bucks with the final say. One